Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How are you doing? It is Monday, June 11th, 2018, getting close to the end of all time. I suppose we can stop telling you what the date is, or that we're in week, I think, 73 of the Trump presidency / the presidential apprentice. Stop marking time. It's all over. Let's all give up and go home, shall we? No, well, of course. We'll go ahead with the show, documenting the atrocities. What a weekend, eh? It's pretty crazy out there, and I mean out there. And it's also out there, which is, I guess, fitting and appropriate. We are ready to go with a live show, regardless of the fact that it seems like the Western world order is collapsing before our very eyes. But, well, at least somebody has a plan for it. That might be Vladimir Putin. But one day, eventually, we'll get translated copies of what we are supposed to be doing and move forward from there. Let's all take marching orders. Let's all get on the same page. Sing Kumbaya in Russian and have a good time. Maybe there are some great benefits in all of it, and we can all finally be as wealthy as we once imagined we would be from being good people. That apparently is not working out, so maybe we'll try the Russian route today. All right, Daily Coast Radio is live now. Let's get serious for just a second. Kagro X, I am told, it is me, but I'm told what to do. If I can't take orders from Vladimir Putin, I'll take them from Bill in Portland, Maine. I'd say that's probably even a better option. So what am I doing today? Kagro X pouts in his chair, that's working so far, with his arms folded while Greg Dworkin leans on a table scowling at him. Gee, where have I seen this imagery before? Yeah, well, that came out of the G, what are we down to? G6 now, plus the 239 pounds that we shipped up there in a potato sack. And he spent all of about 10 seconds at the G7 conference. I think by the time we left on Friday, he had already declared that this whole thing was stupid without Russia, which you would never do if you were a puppet. No puppet, no puppet. And the sniffles are back, too, I note. So we'll do the rest of that. And that, I think, reminds me of how I think we started Friday with the same thing. Yeah, he was already off to the races. He's now in Singapore, and I assume the minute is over. He told us over the weekend how long it would take for him to be able to assess whether or not Kim Jong-un was serious about their talks. And his answer was, about a minute. I would say in the first minute. And, of course, one for the history books. How would you possibly know that? He was asked, and he said, just my feel, my touch. It's what I do. You know, it's one of those things. I'm a deal maker. I can tell. I can read people, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, if the guy greets me with a big fanfare and a red carpet and maybe flowers and all sorts of other trappings of power and office, I will know he's serious. And if he merely shakes my hand and says hello, I don't know. Maybe that's not enough. Although that would ordinarily you would think would be the socialist style. But of course, we're talking about a maniacal dictator. Also very interesting over the weekend, I'm sure you have seen it by now, the Fox News clip. I don't know what the hell they were doing, but they had Anthony Scaramucci on, and it's another way of saying I don't know what the hell they're doing, no matter what they're covering. But they were covering the arrival of the president in Singapore. Nothing, spectacular in and of itself. He was getting off of a plane, but he was deplaning for this supposedly historic summit. And it is historic. Nobody has ever bothered to meet a North Korean dictator before face-to-face as president of the United States, because it never made any sense to do so, and would have been a tremendous victory, was regarded as something that would have been a tremendous victory for the North Koreans, who should not be legitimized as a regime. I think we're kind of beyond that point and have been forced there, of course, by their race for nuclear weapons, despite the fact that we keep insisting as part of our non-proliferation policy that you won't get anywhere, you won't get anything by striving to gain nuclear weapons if you're not currently a nuclear state, so don't try it. But if you want to have an international summit with the President of the United States and get him alone in a room, apparently, one-on-one with you, you can take the nuclear weapons route to get there. Or, of course, you could just buy them from Mike Flynn and that doesn't even necessitate bowing and scraping before Trump. So that option is still open to you. Anyway, that is also something I understand on the agenda for, I don't know when. Today? When do they meet? I don't even know. They're in Singapore. I don't know whether they're going to do a whole build-up and they're going to pre-game this thing for 6 days or what. But eventually we're supposed to get our 1 moment or 1 minute there for Donald Trump to assess whether or not Kim Jong-un is serious. And I think you could probably tell even at a distance just by television. But, I don't want to diagnose anyone remotely. So we're going to let Dr. J. Trump handle that. And at some point, they'll finally meet and they'll have their discussion. And apparently the plan is to, I don't know whether initially or at least at some point, just the two of them, plus translators, of course, are supposed to meet alone in a room. No staff, no national security advisors, no nothing. I don't know about security guys. I'm curious about that because Kim Jong-un is, a little bit of a murderer. And, I'm sure that's our Western bias speaking. If you want to stick your half-brother with a poison needle in an airport somewhere, hey, who am I to, what? I don't know. He's murdered family members. It's difficult to tell who he's had murdered, I guess, is the closer to accurate term. He doesn't do the murdering himself. And so maybe that's keeps Donald Trump safe. I think I should probably, ordinarily I would worry more about this, about the President of the United States. This one, I think he can handle himself. That's what I'll tell myself now. But if you want to put yourself alone in a room, no security with a guy who murders his family members, I guess that's okay. And I guess he'll wear that as a badge of honor and say he's super brave to have done it. I doubt very much that he would go and do that. Although I do have to say it's a spectacular end times play for an apocalyptic dictator maniac. And we did see over the weekend the New York Times bending over backwards to praise Trump for getting this semi-summit thing put together. And what was this? They put together some ridiculous sycophantic front page story, I think, about how he's been preparing his entire adult life for this. Because remember, back in the 80s at one point, he told Ronald Reagan that maybe I would like to, let me negotiate about nuclear arms with the Soviets. I think I can make a deal. I can learn everything there is to know about nuclear weapons in an hour. So, I mean, he can prepare his entire adult life for it. He hasn't prepared at all for it, but he has kind of been. He could have been the whole time, but it would only take an hour anyway. So I don't really know why they gave him that, except that the New York Times sucks. And now everybody will tell me, yeah, you got to cancel your subscription. And you're kind of right, but I need to be able to read their garbage to you from time to time. And sometimes they write some good things, and it's good to share those too. I don't know. Somehow they'll redeem themselves in the end, maybe, by publishing the story, because they're the paper of record. Somehow the story will make it to them. That finally sinks the guy. I don't know. I guess we can hold out hope. Anyway, yeah. So I don't really know where he hopes to get with this. I don't know why they said he was preparing his entire adult life for it. If there's any, I mean, Kim Jong-un hasn't had a very long adult life at this point, but he's part of the Kim dynasty has been preparing for all of its adult lives, it's distributed among the three of them, to isolate a U.S. president without security, alone in a room with one of them. And I mean, it would be kind of a wacky Kim dynasty move to just say, to hell with it all. I'm going to just, stick this guy and then go, international communism superstar, woo! And what's the price, really? Nuclear annihilation? That was in the cards anyway. That's why we built these things. And I guess that'd be a good question. Do you, launch a nuclear strike against North Korea if they assassinate your president? Ordinarily, I would say that people would probably think that was on the table. But then when it comes to launching weapons and having ones launched back, possibly, I guess if you don't believe the North Korean missiles will work, you might try that, but I don't know. I'm not certain how the rest of the world takes that, and I'm not so certain. I think it's an awful thing in the end. Let them have a cage match at that point. Let everybody fight it out, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. I don't think he's quite like that, and Kim Jong-un may be kind of starstruck by Trump in the way that other weirdos around the world apparently have been, and maybe it'll all be fine, and they all do well to, maybe he bought a bunch of those coins, and they went up in value, and he's happy with that, and who knows, maybe they'll make a deal, they'll sign over the giant Pyongyang hotel to the Trump organization, not Donald Trump, because it's totally different. They're giving it to an LLC, so it's okay. It's not emoluments. And we'll withdraw from the Korean Peninsula, and lots of troops get to come home. Hooray! It could work out, or it could fall apart, and it'll all happen in the first minute, apparently. Speaking of the first minute, I've already wasted the first minute of Greg's day. Good morning, Greg. We'll make up for it in the ensuing, 59 or so.
I don't know. We'll do something.
Okay. Good morning.
But, I think the whole thing's a failure, and I'm leaving the show.
Well, now,
That'll show you. That's my negotiating point.
Well, are your arms folded?
What are you going to do about it?
I don't know. I will wait for you to get on the plane, and then I will say, sorry, and then I'll be mad.
Then I'm going to cancel radio.
Yeah. Why not? Plus net neutrality. Let's get rid of that as well. That's right. Slated for destruction today as well. Very slow start to the show. That's the reason.
So a lot happened over the weekend, and I think what's really weird is just how right the experts were, and how wrong the Republicans were. A piece on that. Robert E. Kelly, you remember Robert E. Kelly? He's the guy whose cute little daughters showed up on the video that went viral when he was trying to explain about Korea.
Yes, it was awesome.
So he had a tweet that said, after Reuters reported that Kim Jong-un could leave Singapore at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, 5 hours after the summit meeting with Trump officially kicks off. In other words, very short.
Yes.
Kelly said, get the wanted photo ops with POTUS, forget the rest, and negotiating flam, get the hell out of town to make sure a coup doesn't happen. We are getting played.
Oh.
The other side of the coin, the White House says North Korea talks are, quote, moving more quickly than expected, end quote. So Trump to depart Singapore Tuesday evening as well, not to be one up. And so basically the next thing that happened is that Mike Pompeo announced, this is a piece in The Hill, Trump-North Korea summit will set a framework for future denuclearization talks. In other words, we got nothing. We gave away everything.
Yes.
We got played in public, and the summit is a failure.
We got a coupon good for one denuclearization.
Yeah, pretty much. That's about what we got out of it. And how this is going to be handled by the fawning press, who are going to talk about stagecraft, is going to be pretty remarkable. So all of that was set up by Trump's complete and total meltdown over the G7 over the weekend, which I think, in some ways is an even more important story.
Oh, yeah. And it's not necessarily just because he found out late that Kim Jong-un was bringing his own toilet, and he did not.
Right, and that is a true story.
Yes.
At least that has been reported.
I mean, we'll say it's true.
As the North Koreans put it, Kim is doing this so that the stool divers don't get a chance to really check out what he eats.
Yes, well, we left all the stool divers at home.
But as one of my friends on Twitter said, that is like the worst job at the CIA.
I agree. I would quit.
If you think today it's Monday morning, you're a little tired and you really don't feel like going to work and you think you have a crummy job, that guy has a worse job than you do. I am just saying.
Trump is probably pissed about the idea. Nobody told me I could bring my own favorite toilet.
So let me give you some headlines that I saw over the weekend, and I framed it up in the Pundit Roundup.
Yes.
But this was the New York Times. Trump refuses to sign G7 statement, calls Trudeau weak, upending 2 days of diplomacy. Peter Navarro was on Fox ranting. I mean, trying to prove that he's crazier than Rudy Giuliani about how Trudeau had stabbed Trump in the back and deserves the worst place in hell. And all sorts of things. Larry Kudlow said the same thing, said it was a betrayal, also used the term stabbed in the back. So obviously that was something that they were told to say.
I guess so.
In the Washington Post, amid feud with Trudeau, Trump pulls U.S. from G7 joint statement, so he refused to sign a joint statement. And, of course, as many people pointed out, Trump made it all about the price of milk.
Yeah, as though he knows what it is.
As though he knows what it is. It's interesting because there are cooperatives in Canada to keep the price of milk up that American dairy farmers envy. because their milk prices go up and down to the point where it's very difficult to make a living doing what they're doing. And they're very envious of the Canadian system, so of course Trump hates it. And as many people have pointed out, look, if you can't make a deal with our allies over milk, how are you supposed to make a deal with our enemies over nuclear material?
Yes. Well, one way would be lying and say you already did it.
Another piece from the Washington Post, European leaders outraged by Trump's refusal to sign joint statement. So he's already shafted our allies. As Chuck Todd puts it, the silence of congressional GOPers not named McCain is obviously not surprising anymore, but is there a limit for them? That's something I want to get to with you. It's a fight with Canada and the rest of the G6, only the most important allies of this country. Is the rest of the GOP using, quote, stunned silence, end quote, as their comment? And Ryan Lizzer writes, I've now read numerous defenses of Trump's actions at the G7, and all of them amount to the same thing, blowing up the Western alliance to own the libs.
Yes.
Josh Marshall writes, worth noting the obvious, Trump and his associates are going bonkers because Trudeau humiliated Trump simply by not giving in to his demands and his threats. That's the entirety of this story, full stop. Brendan Nyhan, political scientist, who always cautions us not to be over dramatic in our thinking.
Oh, sure.
Writes, today feels like a turning point. The Western alliance and the global trading system are coming under the same intense strain that Trump has created for our domestic institutions. Will congressional R's continue to stand by, paralyzed by fears of their base?
Yes.
John Harwood writes, Russian autocrat Vladimir Putin wants to break G7 alliance of industrial democracies. Donald Trump just smashed G7 with a sledgehammer while embracing the autocrat. The question for Americans is why? No good answers in sight.
Sure.
David Leonard has a piece. Trump tries to destroy the West. Steve Schmidt has Trump disgraced the presidency of the United States at the G7 summit. I'm trying to give you an idea of the fact that this did not go over well with the pundits. From his slovenly appearance to his unpreparedness, ignorance, and arrogance, he beclowned himself. The Republican majority is filled with cowards who are servile supplicants to the most unfit POTUS ever. Very nearly every elected member of the Republican Congress has chosen Trump and party over our country. It is shameful. They've embraced illiberalism, assaults on the rule of law, attacks on objective truth, and staggering corruption. They betray the oaths with complicity. Despicable doesn't begin to describe it. McConnell has been one of the presiding officers over the destruction of the conservative project and the collapse of decency and nobility in our politics. Now he is a handmaiden to the destruction of our alliances. Ignominy is his destiny.
Holy thesaurus, Batman.
So he wasn't so positive about all of this.
No,
David Frum writes, he's like Heath Ledger's Joker, but without the operational excellence. That was the grim after-action assessment of one senior G7 official whom I spoke in the shocked aftermath of Trump's savage post-summit tweets.
Savage.
Savage.
Yeah. Well, go on. I'll sit idly by here. Hold my comments for the end.
Well, but wait.
Yes.
So Jeff Flake took care of things. He tweeted, fellow Republicans, this is not who we are. This cannot be our party.
Good.
Right? So that takes care of it.
Yeah. Well, I'll vote Republican now.
Oh, no, she tweets. Think about how bad you have to F up for the Pope, the dictionary, and Canada to hate you.
That's a spectacular combination.
Right. So I have a question for you.
All right.
This is a theoretical question. It has to do with process. Oh, by the way, you know that picture that Bill from Portland, Maine was referencing where Angela Merkel is on the table, leaning over, looking at Trump, who has his hands folded, staring off into space.
Yeah.
And a fellow named Guy Verhofstadt tweets the picture with the caption, just tell us what Vladimir has on you. Maybe we can help.
Right.
It's a cute caption, but the fun part is the guy who tweeted it is the ex-prime minister of Belgium.
Well, are there a lot of those?
Well, there's a few.
I guess. All right. Well, well done, Belgium. Although I wondered, did he retire? I wonder if he was bounced from office. Reelect that guy. I have no idea. I'm intervening in Belgian politics again.
Yeah, don't do that.
And I really have to stop that.
I told you not to do that.
I know.
That's what Angela was saying to Donald.
Do recommend
I told you not to hire Nazis, Donald. And what did you do?
Yeah, well, and she's not kidding. They know about hiring Nazis.
They do. So here's the theoretical question for you. Yes. This is a process question. Let's say, for the sake of argument, a handful of moderate Republicans. Just again, this is a thought experiment. So don't tweet at me with the fact that they're cowards and won't do this. I get that. It's a theoretical question.
All right.
What if Bob Corker, especially interesting because he's a committee chair, Jeff Flake, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski, as a group, decide to either become independent and vote with the Democrats or defect and become Democrats? What if they pull a Jim Jeffords? The question on the table is, what does that do to the structure of the Senate? Corker, especially because he's a committee chair.
Yes. I don't know. The problem with it is that in the past, when the majority has changed hands without an election.
2001 and 1953. Got a good article on that.
They have, I don't know what they had in place in 53. I would kind of have to read a little bit about that. In 2001, that was an anticipated circumstance, and they negotiated ahead of time between the parties an agreement about how to transition if it were to come to pass. And there isn't anything like that now. The organizing resolution adopted at the very beginning of a new Congress, the Senate essentially looks around, counts up, decides who's the majority and who's the minority. And they don't have a vote for the majority leader on the floor the way they do for Speaker of the House. It's the majority and minority leaders are strictly party officials, not constitutional officers. So they're elected in the conference and caucus, as they call themselves respectively, as between Republicans and Democrats, and then they're just sort of put forward. The president pro tem is a constitutional officer, but not the majority leader. So in 2001, anticipating that the majority could change hands, the organizing resolution, which is adopted by the Senate right up front and ordinarily takes care of just the task of naming people to committees, and it names them by majority and minority. The majority membership for this committee shall be XYZ. The minority membership shall be XYZ. And in 2001, they had the backup of, okay, and if the balance of power changes, here's how we'll do things. If it's 50-50, or if it switches even further than that, well, then, in other words, they had negotiated a path to transition. Here they haven't done that. And in this kind of atmosphere, normally you just say, well, the majority changes hands, everybody recognizes that, and they reorganize themselves sort of organically. The Democratic leader... Except
there's almost no precedent for that.
Right.
I mean, it's a good theory, but it almost never happens.
The Democratic leader... It happens organically at the beginning of every new Congress, right, when they've had an election.
Yes,
right.
but not in the middle.
Yeah, in the middle they have not, and what they have in place are resolutions of the Senate that say this is the makeup of the committees, this is how many members are here for the majority and what their names are. And these are and every time they change that, if somebody resigns or leaves a committee, they have to pass a resolution to confirm that. So without an agreement in place and Republicans being completely bonkers, I don't really know what they do, especially if it's marked by the defections of Republicans. Suppose the Chuck Schumer rises and seeks recognition as the majority leader. Do they just say, no? Or if Chuck Schumer is recognized but then puts forward an organizing resolution that would change the composition of the committees and give the chairs to Democrats and the majority of the membership on each committee to Democrats, do Republicans filibuster the organizing resolution? And how do you stop that? It's a big question mark. And the threats have been there before.
Remains chair, how do you take that away from him? I want to read something to you. Our friend Martin Longman, known as Boo Man over at Daily Kos once upon a time, now has his own blog and writes for the Washington Monthly these days.
He does, and well.
Put together a really interesting piece. What if Senators Murkowski and Collins defected? And this was in a different situation. This was back in 2017 that he wrote this.
Oh, all right.
But the part that I was most intrigued about is that Senator Bob Bennett, actually explained a lot about what happened in 1953 when he was debating the organizing resolution in January 2000. And it's really interesting. And, of course, for those of you who want to follow along on the radio, you have to remember one key fact.
We don't know what we're doing.
That's a key fact. But
right.
The other key fact that you have to remember is that Hawaii and Alaska weren't states yet.
Oh, yes, true.
They didn't get admitted to the Union till 1959, I believe.
Okay. And,
don't quote me, but I think I know more civics than Trump does. So the number of senators to make a majority isn't 50-50 in those days. So now this was the situation, says Bob Bennett. Because the Republicans had organized the Senate with 49 senators to begin with, they had organized it with the Republican majority on every committee.
Right.
They held that the Republican majority in every committee until Senator Taft died, and then it switched. But at that point, Senator Morse, and this I do remember, said, A, he had been elected as a Republican, and B, the Republicans controlled the administration, and therefore, in order to prevent the new president from being frustrated in his opportunities to get things through, he would, even though he had denounced his Republican Party membership, he voted with the Republicans on organizational issues, giving the Republicans 48, the Democrats 48, and Richard Nixon in the chair breaks the tie. So at this point, what happened is Morse had gotten really mad at Ike, I suppose, and said, I'm not a Republican anymore. I'm an independent. I'll vote with the Democrats, except on this one issue of organizing the majority-minority. I will honor my vote that when I ran, I was a Republican, and therefore I will vote with the Republicans. So therefore, not a precedent, but a choice.
Yes. That's so there's no real rule about what will happen. It has a lot to do with what these people decide to do. And, I mean, in a defection, who knows?
Yeah, so it was 48 Democrats, 47 Republicans, 1 independent. Who knows?
Yeah, we're back there now, I would guess. All right, I'd like to take another look at this, and we got 2 minutes to do it. How about that? We'll be right back.
Hey, okay.
Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're puzzling things out during the break, and I don't think we have it straight entirely just yet, but that's because it really is kind of an unknown. Not only is there no real precedent, there's some, we have the history of what happened. We're in a different situation not only because there's no agreement ahead of time, but because there's probably no agreement possible because we're dealing with the Donald Trump Republican Party. And people who work toward compromise could find themselves falling out of windows.
So this 1953 precedent is actually really interesting for a lot of reasons. Let me set it up a little bit better than I did when I told you the final story about what happened. Okay,
right, tell me the
Dwight
story
Eisenhower is elected president in 1952. Richard Nixon is the vice president.
Yes.
The Republicans take control of the Senate for the first time since 1932. But the margin is only 49-47. Remember, 48-48 is a tie because we're missing 2 states. We haven't admitted Hawaii and Alaska yet.
Okay.
Ohio Senator Robert Taft is the majority leader.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a 49-47 Republican Senate. And they did their organizing, whatever you call it, agreement, resolution, rule, whatever, and so they're the majority, no problem. Well, problem. Republican Senator Wayne Morse gets pissed at the Republicans and quits the party.
Yes.
First, he decides that he's going to not caucus with either side. He's going to take his committee assignments from the Senate, quote, as a whole. People whisper to him that means you don't get any committee assignments. So he decides to caucus with the Democrats.
Yes. That's finally, Angus King should have read that story.
Right. So
he knew what to do in the end. But
exactly.
Okay.
So now it's a 48-48 split. And then Senator Taft dies of cancer. And the Democratic governor of Ohio appoints Thomas Burke, who's a Democrat.
Yes.
Now it's a 49-47 Democratic majority, and then the fight over what to do happens.
Okay. So 49,
that's why it's so interesting in 53.
Yeah.
So the Democrats have a clear majority. That's what would happen if those 4 senators I mentioned happen to move over to the other party or become independents but caucus with the Democrats. But just like in 1953, the Republicans could say it doesn't matter that you have the majority now.
Right.
We had the majority then. However, the reason that the Republicans were able to get away with it in 53 is that Wayne Morse said, I'll vote with the Republicans and they'll win on this because I'm a good soul and I'm honorable. We don't see these things in Congress anymore. And I'll honor the people who voted me in as a Republican.
Okay.
So that would make the 49-47 Senate a 48-48 Senate with Richard Nixon breaking the tie. And that's why Wayne Morse could dictate to the Senate that you need to leave the rules alone and don't touch them.
Okay. Well, yeah. And
does that make sense?
It does. I mean, to me.
It's not how they do it anymore. But that's what happened then.
Right.
And the Democratic argument is, well, that was Wayne Morse being a good dude, but they don't exist anymore. And that was a choice. That was a discretionary vote, not a precedent-setting rule.
Right. And that
so
comes
the
up a lot.
next time there's a Wayne Morse, maybe he decides to vote with us and we win.
That's true. Entirely possible, of course. Or it may be that he was the precursor to every Republican who would ever be in his shoes, and they would chicken out in some way that would be crucial at exactly the wrong moment. Who knows? But yeah, there's no real answer because this was a voluntary one-time decision. Oh, hey, just like Bush v. Gore, which you're not allowed to cite as precedent except for everybody who does it. But yeah, this is a very interesting time in Senate history because as I was discussing during the break, and I guess I'll point this out for everybody else too, at this point with Nixon as vice president, and Morse figures in this too, very shortly, and I guess you can figure out the reason why this was. What sorts of things began to happen in a closely divided Senate, even one where people, did things the old ways, worshiped the old gods, as they say, perhaps in Game of Thrones, and they were about working together and compromise, that guy too. Well, he was asleep at the time. Yeah. At this point, you would guess, even with these old-style senators, there was going to be a lot of difficulty getting things done. And in fact, there was. And this is the period during which the first big push for filibuster reform comes to life. And it's in this position as vice president and president of the Senate that Nixon eventually finds himself, ironically enough, handing down the ruling from the chair that creates the opening that eventually leads to the nuclear option. That recognizing the, not precedent, but handing down the ruling really that a simple majority should be able to determine the rules of the Senate, in particular at the very beginning of a new Senate, but recognizing that a majority can set its own rules despite the fact that there were Senate rules that said they couldn't. And they strengthened those Senate rules again later on when they had this fight. But Morse, I believe, plays a role in all of this later on. This comes about 2 or 3 years down the road in the beginning of the next Senate when they had this fight. But this is very interesting, and right. Part of the reason was that, again, after the first couple of fights on the filibuster reform, they likewise made the decision to change the filibuster, the cloture threshold, down to 60, but they did it by agreeing to engineer a vote whereby people who didn't really believe in what they were voting for would agree to vote for the other side so that they could change the rules without breaking the rule requiring a 2/3 majority to change the rules. It's very interesting, but very hard to explain. So
let's flash forward to 2001 and explain that a little bit. Martin Longman does a really nice job here.
Oh, good. Martin does it. Good. All right.
So the context was the contested 2000 presidential election. Democrats are seething. The Senate is evenly split. I'm paraphrasing a bit here. Partisan feelings are high.
Man.
The Republicans insist that the true split wasn't 50-50. It's 50. Remember, we have a couple of extra states here. So now we're not talking about a 48-48 tie or a 48-48 functional tie, because in theory, the Democrats had a 49-47 majority in 53. Okay, but it was a functional 48-48 with the vice president of the ruling party happened to be Republicans, Richard Nixon, breaking the tie. Now it's 2001. Again. The Senate is split 50-50.
Yes.
The Republicans insist that the true split is 51-50 because Vice President Dick Cheney was constitutionally empowered to break ties.
Yes, but
the Democrats say the Constitution allows the Vice President to break ties on votes on the floor, not votes in committee. They insist the real split is 50-50, so it has to be an equal power share.
Mm-hmm.
So Trent Lott and Tom Daschle broker a compromise.
A what now?
Okay. Everything is split.
Yes.
All the committees are split. All the everything is split.
Money, staff.
Money, staff, offices. However, Lott still is majority leader, and Republicans are the chair people on the committee and the subcommittees. If a tie occurs in a subcommittee, it still gets advanced to the full committee. If a tie occurs on a full committee, it still gets advanced to the floor.
Okay.
So some of the moderate Republicans, like John Warner, objected. He said that if he takes responsibility of a chairman, he ought to have the ability to advance bills without partisan logjams. And Lott convinced him to give up your chairman prerogative on this, as Longman puts it, correctly assessing that nothing would get done in the Senate if the Democrats weren't appeased.
Yes.
So they agreed to this, which only happened for a little while, and then, elections took care of the rest. But the point is, both in 53 and in 2001, which are the most recent examples, if there's others, I don't know of them, of what happens if the majority becomes not in the majority after you've already set these organizing principles.
Yes.
In both cases, it turned out that it was in 53 a functional tie, and in 2001 an actual tie. The theoretical example that I'm giving of those four senators moving over is it's a clear Democratic majority, which didn't sort of happen. It sort of happened in 53, didn't happen in 2001. And so what the actual precedent is terribly unclear, because nobody really knows what happened, because it doesn't look like it's ever happened before.
Yeah, it's not like this. And certainly not with mass defections.
Right. So now you're not arguing that in the case of a tie, we get to win because we won originally. We're talking about the fact that you no longer have the majority.
Yeah. And
why is that important? Because
I don't know.
Going back to, the G7 and the wreckage of the Western Alliance, what if moderate Republicans decide they have enough? Or what if it's firing over Mueller? Or what if it's some other issue that's big enough, like completely giving up the store for nothing in return in Korea? What if it's some issue near and dear to you, and you decide, I've had enough, and my colleagues and I have decided that we're going to switch? Because this is just, it's one thing to tweet about it, it's another thing to make a floor speech about it. But what if, this is a theoretical episode here, it's a thought experiment. What if 3 or 4 of the senators decide they have had enough of this Trump experiment and they're done?
Well, that would be nice. I wish some of them had.
Yeah, I mean, you look and you say, okay, Jeff Flake, you made speeches, you haven't done anything, and even if you voted, you couldn't break a partisan filibuster anyway. Let's say you decided to go yes on gun control or gun safety, and yes, you decided to stop immigration, separation of families at the border, or whatever, because you decided Trump was just wrecking things beyond the ability. Or what if you did it on tariffs? What if you did it on something you actually care about? And free trade. And then you decided that, it's time that you stopped passing things that are bad and started passing things that are good, and enough talk, you actually decided to take action. My whole theoretic question here is, would that action actually accomplish anything? Or could Mitch McConnell pull other arcane rules and say, okay, well, you can have the committee, but I deny you power, water, lighting, and the room, and you have to go. I mean, At what stage does the majority leader actually get to say, I'm turning stuff off, and you don't really get to do what you thought you just won the ability to do?
Yeah, I'm not certain, and it's difficult to predict because it's a question.
We remember committee meetings where the majority turned the lights off and the microphones off.
Right, and that was under normal circumstances, so-called normal circumstances, which we all want to go back to.
Yeah.
Oddly enough.
Regular order, as we like to call it.
Yes. So there's no telling, just not only because there's no real super clear precedent, but because even if there was, in normal times, you would argue the most extreme interpretations of it as necessary, which is just regular, plain old hardball. And then there's, out of the ordinary constitutional hardball where you say, these guys may try anything, including up to and including turning off the lights, the water, the heating, whatever you need in those
locking
committees.
The doors.
And just sitting there and saying, I know you have a working majority, but look, the Senate has this resolution. Nothing has repealed it. And I mean, there are ways to try to force measures to the floor. And I think ultimately because it's never really been handled exactly this way. But somewhere buried in the rule book is an answer to why it would be fruitless in the end for a once majority, now minority party to try to hang on. Eventually, you'd be able to, use Rule 4 to force something to the floor and redo the organizing resolution. And although it's possible for them to filibuster the organizing resolution, you could then say, well, if we do have a functioning majority, we can change the rules, at least temporarily, to get a cloture vote by simple majority on an organizing resolution and then immediately erase the precedent if we want to.
And then you can start hitting people with canes.
Yeah.
Because that's been done.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing is that it looks
Fantastic
awful.
idea.
And in the end, what's supposed to happen is everybody's supposed to take a step back and say, the optics of this are really bad. It looks bad. And if we try to push this, people are going to vote against us. Just like the collusion may not be a crime, but impeachment is the remedy for things that are bad but don't necessarily break the letter of the law.
Right. But there's plenty of that, too.
There's plenty of that, too. So it's all
out.
fascinating because Trump is actually going that far, pushing the envelope that far, and I think it's worthwhile considering some of these possibilities.
Right. It's very exciting. We live in exciting times, which is not a Chinese proverb, I think.
If you're a process guy, this is really interesting.
Yes.
But
right.
I thought it was. I'm not a process salesman, and I thought it was really interesting. I like learning process because I like to understand what's going on here.
Yes.
And so, when Jeff Flake speaks up, or John McCain speaks up, or Susan Collins, who tweeted, speaks up, I assume that they're tweeting not because they're getting ready to join the Democrats, but because they figure Twitter's the only way they're ever going to get Donald Trump to hear what they're saying.
Oh, yeah, that's true. They can't get on Fox News with it. They could try that.
Right.
Yeah. Other than
so I'm
porn,
not mad at them
vector.
for, well, why do you say that, but you don't vote that way? But, in the end, do they have this in their back pocket? And, do they threaten somebody with it?
They must think about it from time to time. It's
so we should too, and that's my purpose in bringing it up.
All right. You don't want to be caught flat-footed should it happen. You'll be so embarrassed that you don't
want to be
flat-footed.
Right. You'd like to prepare for these sort of things, unlike Donald Trump, who just does it by feel.
Yes. If there's a draft, you wouldn't mind being flat-footed, probably.
Right. Meanwhile, let's just finish out my segment and leave you with all the other stuff to talk about with this bizarre story from Politico. Meet the guys who taped Trump's papers back together.
Here's the illegality I was talking about.
The president's unofficial filing system involves tearing up documents into pieces even when they're supposed to be preserved. So then there's a staff who tapes it together and then they get fired.
Yes, and they were like highly paid specialist archivists whose jobs were converted into taping back together things that the president tears up, which is amazing.
This is funny. So one of his colleagues, Reginald Young, who worked as a senior records management analyst, said during over 2 decades of government service, he's never been asked to do such a thing. The fellow named Lardy, who was not working alone. I had a letter from Schumer. He tore it up. It was the craziest thing. He ripped papers into tiny pieces, so they put it back together so it could be preserved. We had to endure this under the Trump administration, Young said. I'm looking at my director and saying, are you guys serious? We're making more than $60,000 a year. We need to be doing far more important things than this. It felt like the lowest form of work you can take on without having to empty the trash cans. I suggest this guy read the story about stool diving for Kim Jong-un if he thinks that this is the worst possible job. Yeah, I mean, there were worse jobs than this dude. So suck it up and tape those things together.
I guess so. And by the way, I think I had maybe said that they were highly paid government specialists. They are apparently not very highly paid government specialists, but $60,000 to tape things back together really actually sounds like a good deal, to be honest. But the thing is, you're not supposed to have to tape them back together. And just to pull out a piece of that guy's quote, he says, "It was the craziest thing." So once again,
I can imagine.
It's a crazy thing. And I have to read it, but I mean, maybe no one else wants to. We have to read the Presidential Records Act to be sure. But I mean, most of these things, you mean to tell me that in there somewhere there's not a clause anywhere that says something like, whosoever shall destroy, cause to be destroyed, or attempt to destroy records covered under said act shall be subject to imprisonment or fine, blah, blah. It's a Presidential Preservation of Records Act, and of course, there's got to be something in there somewhere. If you knowingly destroy presidential records, you've got to be in trouble somehow, right? There's got to be something, otherwise it's not an act.
The fun part about this, and I'm going to finish with a rant from Tom Nichols that I just
really
enjoyed.
He should tear up the Presidential Records Act is what he should do.
I know, but I'm just stepping back and thinking, you know what's really fun about Washington? There are people that shrug when Trump goes and gives away the store to the North Koreans.
Yes.
And, roll their eyes when Trump destroys the G7 and makes disparaging comments and gets the Canadians to hate us, which is nearly impossible. But absolutely lose it, wax wroth, and just completely lose it if somebody rips up a piece of paper, because everybody has a different threshold.
Well, if you're the paper guy or the tape guy,
everybody has a different threshold for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I'm not allowed to speak out about
these things. And
it's just funny.
Yeah, well, that is funny. We have specialties. Everyone's specialized here in Washington. So I keep my head down. I don't know what's going on in North Korea, but when the papers show up ripped, that's my world.
That's it. So Tom Nichols had this little piece to talk about how to talk about this stuff, and I thought it was very good. He says, It's not that I disagree about policy with Trump supporters. Mm-hmm. It's that I know they don't give a crap about policy. That's not the word he used. There's no way to have a policy argument with people whose eyes are always looking up to the television for a cue from dear leader about what to say next. As J.V. Last once said, Trumpism is non-falsifiable. Whatever Trump does is right. It's like what we used to say about conservatism. Conservatism can never fail, right? It's just that you failed conservatism. Mm-hmm. Whatever Trump does is right. There's no principled arguments to be had, because if Trump changes his mind or tweets something off the wall, Trumpers change their positions immediately. Yes. Well, of course you want to rip up papers. That's the thing to do. You elitists keep trying to... This would basically be a cult, except for one thing. Most Trumpers don't really believe their own BS. Yeah, some of them really are stupid enough to think Trump is a good man and all that crap, but most of them are only interested in Trump as a vehicle of social disruption. Mm-hmm. That whole thing about owning the libs is absolutely true.
Yeah.
Trump's smarter enablers see him as an equalizer, a way to put them on an equal footing with elites, who they think look down on them. The thing is, elites do look down on them, for good reason. Most of Trump's sycophants are second-raters at best. I'm thinking Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro. For them, Trump is their shot, or Greg Pruitt. They know he's emotionally disordered, to use Peter Wiener's term, but they don't care. This is their one chance to grab the car keys and throw a kegger before mom and dad get back home. That makes talking with them about policy impossible. So if it seems like I don't engage Trump's enablers on the merits of this or that Trump policy, it's because I can't take Trump's policies any more seriously than Trump or his minions do. It's either pure stupidity, pure careerism. Either way, it's a waste of time. And yeah, there are people in government trying to hold everything together. I salute them. Hope they can keep the ship afloat. But they can't make policy either. They can issue directives and hope for the best, mostly hoping Trump doesn't notice and overrule them via tweet. I think we'd all be less exhausted if the Trumpers would just admit that what they value from Trump is the social leveling effect he has, forcing intelligent people to respond endlessly to stupid comments and bad ideas that continue pretending they care about policy. That's what annoys me so much about the whataboutism. So Trump wrecked the G7 alliance. So he's giving up the store and elevating a dictator to the world stage. Well, but what about when Obama wore a tan suit and put his feet on the desk?
Yes.
It's a totally equivalent, and you libs don't even get it. For myself, Tom says, I'm resigned that Trump will be president for as long as he's president, and how it ends up is up to the voters.
Whatever happens, happens.
But I don't see the need to engage in the cynical BS of arguing policy with people who will change their minds on anything in nanoseconds. And for the love of God, don't tell me about what Trump's real Americans in the heartland want. I know what they want. More government action, including money, delivered with a smile, inflated respect, and pity, earned or not. Those are utterly pointless discussions, too. Trump's going to do what he's going to do. He's not liberal or conservative. It's all just the blurted thoughts of an angry, frightened man who won an office he didn't really want. We have to get through it, but we don't have to pretend we're arguing about real things. So I think that's, exactly on point. There's no point in arguing policy. If you're a policy person like me, and I only do the politics to get the policy, what's the point of all of this? The Trump people don't really care. They just want to own the libs, and let's just say it.
I guess so. And, well put there, I guess. No real hope, obviously, and of convincing any of them. And of course, that's strictly speaking about the diehards.
Right, you're right, exactly. I mean, there are people that voted for him that have regrets. There's plenty
if there are
of
others
those,
of them
and
who'll
that's why his
die
numbers
easier,
don't go
get
up.
them.
But the people who are still supporting him at this point, you say something like it's ridiculous to blow up the Western alliance and have nothing in its place, to disrespect our allies, to get Canada to hate us, to enter trade wars that are going to hurt the United States and hurt our economy. And then you have Trumpers saying, yeah, well, you just don't want to ever acknowledge he ever did anything positive. I mean, those are actual discussions people have. Yeah. And it's like, what?
Yeah. True. And I'm glad that he makes note of the tearing up the papers thing. Like, oh yeah. And that's exactly what they'll say. That's exactly what you want to do. Don't you know you want to shred things to keep things secret? It's not that. And it's also against the law. And
then Trump says, oh, well, I made a mistake. Yeah. And then they go, well, now you're pillorying him because the guy made a mistake. Come on. You guys can't cut him a break no matter what.
I could believe it on day one. Oh, I can't? I mean, because he's an idiot. He has no idea that he's supposed to preserve presidential papers. Plus, he can't believe he's president. But, right. By the end of the first week, no more ripping up papers.
Well, Mueller, emoluments, elections.
Sure.
There's things ahead of us that we need to keep an eye on. So that's my ranting beginning of the week for you, just to set the stage and make you feel good. If you haven't torn your hair out by now, I don't know what to tell you. This is Greg Dworkin speaking with my friend David Waldman Kagro in the morning. I left you an article about McClatchy pointing out how the Russians were totally involved with the NRA, and
yes.
The Brits are reporting how the Russians were totally involved with the Brexit vote. So, there's a lot going on here that we're not paying attention to that I think is going to be interesting. And it'll be even more interesting if it turns out that NRA and Brexit ties reveal more to us about the Russian connection than what our own Congress is willing to do.
Oh, well, they don't, it's because there's a tie to our own Congress. That's why they're not talking about that one. I mean,
oh, really?
Yeah. It's just, we caught them on tape, remember?
I'm shocked that there's gambling in this casino.
Yeah. So
anyway, take care.
All right.
I'll talk to you Wednesday, and we'll see how it all turns out. Maybe the summit will last an hour and a half. Maybe it'll be a great success and last an hour and 3/4.
Right. Or maybe he'll tear up all the paper that's in there before they even get started, and no one will know what to do.
You know who said it's not worth the piece of paper it's printed on?
No.
Back to World War II.
Oh.
What was the scrap of paper?
Oh, well, I don't know. The Constitution? Probably.
Something like that. It's trees that the Germans ignored.
Oh. Well, all right then. That's Germans. They've gotten better.
Yes, as Tom Leary used to say, we taught them a lesson in 1918, and they've hardly bothered us since then.
Well, all right. We can appreciate. Everyone appreciates that.
Right.
Excellent.
The funny thing is that the German people are just so much ahead of where we are on this. It's just incredible.
Well,
but of course, there's reasons. Sure. Take care, and I will talk to you on Wednesday.
All right. Very good. Unless I tear up our contract. Thanks, Greg. There's a lot to this, and I don't really mean to hang up on the tearing up of paper, but there is an awful lot to it. I mean, just in terms of the legality and the sense you get of Trump's, really disrespect for the office. In addition to they do note in the article that not only is he tearing it up, he sometimes is throwing the stuff on the floor. Like, I don't even have to use a garbage can. I'm that important. I got people to pick things up. And it's weird that he does this. It's a weird habit. I mean, it's inexplicable. I could understand it if it came from, well, I'm a businessman, which he isn't, and we have to keep our dealings confidential, and there's all sorts of industrial espionage going on out there, and someone might seek to rifle through my garbage to try to figure out what kind of deals I'm making before they're publicly announced. But I mean, that was never happening to Donald Trump because no one cares about the deals he was making. If you find out about a deal he's making before it's announced in public, it's a signal to run away from it. He's terrible at this. But in the conceit that he has, that he's a high-powered businessman, he might, have this idea that I need to shred my papers. But then he does an incomplete job of it. You can't shred it by hand and have that be effective. And some of them, they were saying they just tear it in half, and it's unclear whether that's a fit of pique or whether, and this is the odder possibility, it was described in the article like it was just a weird habit he has. Like, if you put a piece of paper on his desk for him to read, just a memo, whatever it is, this is your schedule for the day, or so-and-so has written you a nice letter and said hello. He reads it, and his way of signifying that he's done reading it is to tear it in half and toss it on the floor or in the garbage. Not necessarily as a sign of disrespect, but to show that he's finished with the thing. Like that character that was it Mike Myers did it when he was a photographer. Was it, I don't know, was it Austin Powers or something else? Shooting, and I'm spent. And he would throw the camera and an assistant would have to catch it. It's nuts. Plus, it's illegal. And I mean in a serious way. We'll maybe discuss it when we come back from this short break. All right, welcome back now to this distracted episode of the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Trying to Google up whether or not there really is a remedy clause in the Presidential Records Act, and what do you do with violations? I don't want stories about potential violations. I want to know what is, like, where do they have it in the act, or is there a remedy or a punishment clause of some kind, and is there not? I don't know. I don't think I have the time to conduct that inquiry on the air and keep you entertained as we do it. But it wouldn't be the biggest shock in the world to find out that no, they didn't write a penalty into it, because you're talking about really punishing the president or the presidential staff, and no president or presidential staffer is going to intentionally destroy stuff like this. But I mean, of course they would. And the act is written, I think, in 1978, so it's post-Watergate. I mean, it must have occurred to them that something could be destroyed that way. They had witnessed things being destroyed. And I don't know, but it's not immediately apparent, and maybe I'm just looking in the wrong place, because that's not the most prominently displayed and not the most frequently researched section of the Presidential Records Act. But we also have other evidence that he doesn't give a goddamn one way or the other about anything in particular, or any law, but much less the Presidential Records Act. I mean, there was a problem with the Presidential Records Act in his deleting tweets. He doesn't care. There's a problem with it, potentially with his, blocking people, and that got overturned in a lawsuit, right? Or it was deemed to be illegal for him to be blocking people, and I don't really know why. I understand the reasoning, and given the fact that he can just mute people to ignore them instead, I suppose. But I don't know why he was bothering to do it. I think the block button was the only thing he knew about. He didn't know about muting. But I'm not certain that the Presidential Records Act is necessarily implicated by blocking people. The tweets still exist, and they'll still be archived. But the deletion of tweets was an issue for a while anyway. And now we are just tasking people to clean up after him so that he won't be in trouble. I mean, that's kind of the way they put it in the, was it Politico? Yeah, the Politico story that Greg referenced and now everyone's talking about. And That I guess also very interesting was the observation, I think, by Maggie Haberman, now that I think about it, on Twitter, that she was interested in the fact that the writer of the Politico piece, Annie Carney, had uncovered this story about the problems with the presidential records in pursuing instead the story about the firings of the officials who had been responsible for cleaning up after the president and his messes, and that they ended up getting fired. I guess probably because I think it's speculative out there, and it's probably pretty good speculation. I would say that they thought that maybe those guys were leaking some of the negative information to the press that was evidenced in the papers that he was tearing up. And I don't know whether that's a good guess or not, but it doesn't really matter. And there isn't much opportunity to do anything about it in terms of their employment situation. But I thought that was an interesting note on all this. Also, just a good question about whether are other presidents signing documents with Sharpies the way he is, or do they use like regular pens normally? There's a close-up picture of him signing a document. And by the way, it looks to me like his signature is changing and not in... I don't know what you can tell. I'm not a handwriting analyst. I'm just simply saying that, one, his fingers are very, very short in this picture. This is a close-up of his hands, and I don't know why he allows that. And two, no, seriously, his signature is changing, and I wonder whether that's indicative of anything. He has a very distinctive signature. All right. Well, anyway, as this article lays out, well, I mean, what else do we need to uncover from this? I mean, besides the fact that there were two people being paid to tape everything back together, and I thought the very odd revelation that that's how he's like shows that he's done with paper is pretty amazing. That and they can't get him to break this habit. Like, done with this, tears it and throws it. But it's like, it really is like a toddler. Like, don't do that. Why are you throwing paper all over the place? And he keeps his desk so empty. I'm wondering what it's like. I've seen pictures of him in his Trump Tower office, and it's stacked with papers, and it's a total wreck. But he likes to keep the Resolute desk clear for pictures. Does he have just days where he sorts through piles and throws paper all over the place? I don't know. I think it's indicative of a lot of things, not the least of which is the possibility of his mental illness. But we'll leave that to others. There are many other stories. The one which everybody was talking about just before air that also Greg mentioned was the McClatchy piece, Web of Elite Russians. And we hate the elites, right? Especially if they're elite Russians, I guess. Unless you like elites and love talking with them, but like screaming about how you hate the elites. That's a possibility. You can do that. It's a big lie, but certainly not beyond Trump or anyone else these days. Web of Elite Russians met with NRA executives during the 2016 campaign. And of course, if you read this story, you probably had the feeling, of course they did. Didn't we already know this? And we did. We knew the name of one or two Russian elites who were heavily involved with the NRA. And I guess we now find more, and that some of them more closely connected to Vladimir Putin's inner circle, as they say, or, as it says here in the opening sentence, high in the Russian Orthodox Church, which I wouldn't necessarily have expected, now identified as having contact with the NRA officials during the campaign. And, of course, the suspicion for a long time has been that they used the NRA to launder foreign donations. I don't know. I guess the NRA there's no particular reason why they couldn't accept foreign money. And although there is already a very robust and not at all in doubt body of law that says if you give foreign money to someone who's legally allowed to accept it, and then that person or entity just turns around and gives that money to a presidential campaign, that's not enough to launder this thing. Money, as we learned from Republicans when they were busy screaming about what they didn't like about liberal lobbying groups, money is fungible. I, of course, learned this lesson from Ernie Istuk and his accomplices in putting together what he managed to engineer into calling the Istuk Amendment back in the mid-1990s. But it's a well-known concept. He didn't invent it or anything, and it's been recognized all the time. I mean, it's a basic principle of law, and the Supreme Court has made rulings in cases that turn on the fungibility of money, so it's a pretty well-established precedent. You can't just do that. And there has to be, I mean, there is some flexibility. It can't necessarily be the case that if a entity takes $10 in foreign money and then 16 years later makes a $500 contribution, if they're capable of doing so, or some in-kind contribution perhaps to a presidential campaign or congressional campaign. It's not necessarily a foreign money laundering issue, but I guess, if you establish enough of an evidentiary trail that $6 million of foreign money came in and $5.8 million of foreign money went out pretty quickly, well, there's a lot less difficulty in reaching the conclusion that you were basically just laundering the money. Anyway, that's long been suspected, and by long I mean the last, 6 months plus. And I guess really for us, it's been more than a year since we were reading about the strange relationship between Russians and the NRA and the trips that American alt-right figures were taking to Russia under NRA auspices and are still doing, by the way, even currently as we speak. And so it won't come as much of a surprise. But I guess this will give us details about new names and apparently their association with the Russian Orthodox Church, oddly enough. And as Greg mentioned, was it in this story or in another? Apparently a long-standing connection to the Brexit campaign as well. And I even see Spanish authorities mentioned in here. We might as well quickly zip through this. Peter Stone and Greg Gordon, writing for McClatchy. Several prominent Russians, some in President Vladimir Putin's inner circle or high in the Russian Orthodox Church, now has been identified as having contact with NRA officials during the campaign, according to photographs, interesting, and an NRA source. The contacts have emerged amid a deepening Justice Department investigation, you know all about it, into whether Russian banker and lifetime NRA member Alexander Torshin, he was the guy whose name we first heard about this, illegally channeled money through the gun rights group to add financial firepower to Donald Trump's campaign. Other influential Russians who met with NRA representatives during the campaign include Dmitry Rogozin, who until last month served as deputy prime minister overseeing Russia's defense industry. That would be a big deal. And Sergei Rudov, head of one of Russia's largest philanthropies, the St. Basil the Great Charitable Foundation. I guess that's the connection to the church. St. Basil, of course, the name of the Russian Orthodox, do they call them cathedrals? The famous multicolored onion-domed church just outside the Kremlin in Moscow. The picture, the iconic picture of Moscow that you see all the time. Let's see. So, I don't know. I assume that there's some connection there, but maybe not. But probably. The foundation, that is the St. Basil the Great Charitable Foundation. And he was just regular St. Basil until Donald Trump got a hold of him. And it's a great charitable foundation. That foundation, launched by ultranationalist ally of President Putin, again, Sergei Rudov is his name. The Russians talked and dined with NRA representatives, mainly in Moscow. As U.S. presidential candidates vied for the White House, now U.S. investigators want to know if relationships between the Russian leaders and the nation's largest gun rights group went beyond vodka toasts and gun factory tours, evolving into another facet of the Kremlin's broad election interference operation. Even as the contacts took place, Kremlin cyber operatives were secretly hacking top Democrats' emails and barraging Americans' social media accounts with fake news stories aimed at damaging the image of Hillary Clinton and boosting the prospects of Donald Trump. It is a crime, potentially punishable with prison time, to donate or use foreign money in U.S. elections campaigns. And so we'd be talking about imprisoning our own folks here. We'll probably never get a hold of those Russians, unless, of course, we sanction them, which is, we won't get a hold of them, but we could get a hold of their money and their assets. And that's a whole other issue of inquiry, area of inquiry that we could dedicate another show or two to, and we probably will. I can almost promise you that, because there's something real going on here. McClatchy, in January, disclosed that Justice Department Special Counsel Robert Mueller was investigating whether Torsion or others engineered the flow of Russian monies to the NRA. The Senate Intelligence Committee is also looking into the matter, but probably to no effect. Sources familiar with the probe have said. The sources spoke on condition of anonymity. You know why. They are, they're part of they're talking about part of the sweeping parallel investigations into Russian interference in the U.S. elections. This is now like blah, blah, blah material here. Let's see. NRA spokesman Andrew, he's got an interesting and difficult to read last name. Arulanandam, I'm guessing, is his last name. NRA spokesman said FBI hasn't contacted the group. A photograph taken during the 2015 trip to Russia by leaders of the NRA showed them meeting with Torsion, Rogozin, and Rudolph, and a source knowledgeable about the visit confirmed this about the gathering. They spoke on condition of anonymity, of course. The NRA, Trump's biggest financial backer, and that's really the important part to remember in all this. Well, what does that matter? I mean, yes, money laundering, but is it really, a big deal? Yes, Trump's biggest financial backer. They spent more than $30 million to boost, as they say, his upstart candidacy. So pretty important. That's more than double what it laid out for 2012 nominee Mitt Romney. And the NRA money started flowing much earlier in the cycle for Trump. Torsion has drawn focus in part because he was implicated in a years-long investigation by Spanish authorities, remember this one, into money laundering by the Russian mob. And really, money laundering coming up in the context of Donald Trump. Who could have guessed? Spanish prosecutor Jose Grinda, who has led that investigation, was in Washington late last month and met with FBI officials for several hours, a well-placed source said. During his visit, Grinda also acknowledged in an appearance at the Hudson Institute, of all places, that a few months ago his office provided the FBI with transcripts of wiretaps in which a since-convicted Russian money launderer spoke with Torsion and called him El Padrino, Spanish for Godfather. Yahoo News reported. Spanish authorities, that's interesting, Godfather. Nothing there, right? Spanish authorities have alleged that Torsion helped launder money years ago into Spanish hotels and banks. What? Hotels? You kidding? For Russian mobsters. A development first reported in 2016 by Bloomberg News. Torsion was among 38 Russian government officials, oligarchs, and companies sanctioned by the United States in this April, for retaliation for the Kremlin's U.S. election meddling and other aggressions around the world, including Ukraine and Syria, for which, of course, Russia was kicked out of the G8, and despite which, apparently, no puppet, Donald Trump wants them reinstated. Because why are we making deals without Russia? Well, because they're a bunch of a-holes. Why do you want to make deals with Russia? Because they're a-holes. Well, unfortunately, that's the answer to both questions. It's unclear whether Torsion's NRA activities or his alleged money laundering in Spain influenced the decision to bar Americans from doing business with him. Now, deputy governor of Russia's central bank, Torsion has denied mob ties, because that's a terrible, problem if you're a bank director. They don't want that. As well as any role in money laundering in Spain or in secretly routing money to the NRA. Last month on Capitol Hill, Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee who examined Russian interactions with the NRA reached a preliminary conclusion that, quote, the Kremlin may also have used the NRA to secretly fund Mr. Trump's campaign. Citing that finding, Democratic Representatives Ted Lieu of California and Kathleen Rice of New York asked FBI Director Christopher Wray in a May 24th letter to expand the inquiry to also explore whether Kremlin money flowed illegally to the NRA for use in influencing House and Senate races. Yes. Illegal campaign contributions by a foreign nation, especially one whose interests stand in stark contrast to those of the United States, threaten the very underpinnings of our democracy, boring, and cannot remain unchallenged, Lieu and Rice wrote. Christopher Wray probably tore it up with Donald Trump and threw it in the garbage. The NRA reported spending $24.4 million to back Republican candidates for Congress in 2016. And so, basically, I'll just tell you this. If Russian money in bulk went in and then any money came back out, money being fungible, the answer is absolutely yes. they funded congressional races. The end. That's the case. Open and shut. Spokespeople for the FBI and Mueller's office declined to comment on the letter. Senior Democrat in the House Intelligence Committee echoed concerns about whether Russian money might have found its way through the NRA to congressional races. California Representative Adam Schiff also said it's important to trace whether the Russians used the prominent gun rights group to conceal financial backing for Trump to determine whether that would constitute leverage against our now president, a favor that could leave him beholden to the Kremlin. Just one of many, I'm sure. In a weeks-long exchange of letters with Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, NRA General Counsel John Fraser disclosed that the group accepts foreign donations, but that none has been used in elections, and that Russian contributions and member dues totaled $2,500 in 2016. Well, A, probably not, and B, if you accept foreign donations, it doesn't matter that you can't sit there and claim that those dollars didn't make it into the use of elections. Money is fungible. Yes, they did. They replaced other money that may have gone if you're really trying to track the physical bills. And two, there's no chance that Russian contributions and member dues, I mean, it may be that they totaled $2,500, but what about other money for other purposes? Or are you just lying? There's also that. In April, Fraser cut off the exchange without divulging any of the group's so-called dark money donors, who are allowed to contribute anonymously and can further shield their identities behind shell companies. It's unclear whether the group has traced the sources of all those funds, and I suppose they could have tried to remain willfully ignorant of who was donating it and what those LLCs were really all about, if they were used. Of the $30 million the NRA reported spending to support Trump, more than $21 million was spent by its lobbying arm, whose donors are not publicly reported. Two NRA insiders say that and that's probably, maybe that's how he was able to use this dodgy language. The NRA's lobbying arm, I forget what they call their group, but yeah, a lot of organizations have this, where they have a 501c3, C4 type organization that is the public face of things. And then there is a NRA Action Fund, or even, AFL-CIO Education Fund, or whatever they want to call it, that is a supposedly separate entity, but gee whiz, if it isn't directed by pretty much the same people. And, sometimes they can avoid the appearance of impropriety that way, depending on how well they segregate their funds. Maybe that's something they were trying to do. Maybe not. Two NRA insiders say that overall the group spent at least $70 million, including resources devoted to field operations and online advertising, which are not required to be publicly reported. And that's a pretty huge problem at this stage of the game. Here comes a familiar name. NRA officials first forged a relationship with Torshin, a close Putin ally, and his protege, remember, Maria Butina, in 2011. That's a long time ago. Soon, Torshin helped Butina start a Russian gun rights group, not a furniture store or design shop like she originally had, called Right to Bear Arms. In 2016, upon Trump's election as president, Torshin tweeted that he and Butina were the only Russian lifetime members of the NRA. For 5 years, Torshin flew to the United States to attend the group's annual conventions, culminating in a 2016 affair in Louisville. Torshin briefly met Donald Trump Jr. at a dinner during the event, but failed in efforts to arrange a private meeting with the big Trump. Months earlier, in December 2015, Torshin and Butina's gun rights group hosted an NRA delegation led by NRA board member and former President David Keene for a week of lavish wining and dining in Moscow. During their visit, the NRA group met with Rogozin, who served as a deputy prime minister overseeing Russia's military-industrial complex for 7 years and previously was Russia's ambassador to NATO. Late last month, Putin put him in charge of the Russian space program. Rogozin is a far-right nationalist who has extensive ties to the Russian arms industry that he managed and is deeply hostile to the West, said Mike Carpenter, who was a Russia specialist while a senior Pentagon official in the Obama administration. Another Russia expert, Atlantic Council fellow Anders Aslund, was flabbergasted, boing, that the NRA delegation met with Rogozin. I can't understand the NRA meeting with Rogozin since he was sanctioned in 2014. It's so embarrassing. But they love their guns over there, despite the fact, of course, that the NRA, in the olden days was about, we got to be ready. We got to be armed because the Russians may invade us with their AK-47s. And now the thing is, maybe we'll either invite them to come with their AK-47s because maybe they'll sell them to us, or maybe they'll just let us borrow them and shoot them for a while. If a bunch of Russians show up with AKs, it's cause for celebration now at the NRA rather than fear of invasion. Rudolph's career, not Rudolph, it does sound like Rudolph. Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, right? His career has kept him on a lower profile trajectory, running a conservative religious charity, the St. Basil's the Great Charitable Foundation. St. Basil's chairman and founder is Putin ally and Orthodox Church figure Konstantin Malofeyev, a Russian billionaire sanctioned also in 2014 by the U.S. Treasury Department because of his support for Russian-backed separatists who invaded Crimea early that year. See, what's the big deal, right? Carpenter said Malofeyev's foundation is used to support his various causes, which have included financing mercenaries who forcibly wrested control of the eastern Ukraine from the Kiev government. Just what most people think they're doing when they give to the St. Basil's the Great Charitable Foundation. So, whatever. Just another sort of extreme example of how, wow. I mean, the lines between government and everything else, mob, church, business, is so blurred in Russia that, the idea of, they weren't acting on behalf of the government, or it was, a private group that did it, or it was a charitable foundation that did it. Yeah. They're all under the control of the same guys, and we should recognize that already. But there's a lot about what Russia's doing that we don't quite grasp at this point, though some people are beginning to catch on. Liu, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said in an interview that he finds it very odd for Putin's allies to meet with the NRA because they don't actually have a similar interest in making sure that people bear arms. True. Though they might have an interest in selling those arms. That is one thing. The Russian government has generally restricted citizens from owning shotguns and, after 5 years of licensed use, a hunting rifle. Given the web of contacts between top Russians and the NRA during the presidential race, Liu said, it appears that something very bad happened in 2016. It's an interesting angle on the whole thing. Yeah, they don't really have gun rights in Russia the same way they do here, so that can't really be it, although I'm sure Torshin would say, I think we should be able to. And Butina's whole job is to say, I think we should be able to. But that's not what's happening. And probably, just like our own NRA, their interest in it is not so much about individual gun rights as it is being able to sell weapons. And that really kind of explains Rogozin's interest in the whole thing, among other things. All right. So I mentioned that there are some other things that need some explaining, or that this reminds me of. And let's see how many of them can we fit into the last segment of the show, which is coming up. Probably at least reference to a couple of them. Let me see if I can find all the things I wanted to. Okay, well, we'll have to line those up for later. And I guess what we'll drop on you and maybe not explore quite as closely are other references we've been saying over and over again, that, for instance, that there's a close relationship between what went on here and what went on in the UK with respect to the Brexit campaign. And just in case you have forgotten, because we hadn't called her name in a couple of weeks, Carol Cadwalader, I'm guessing, once again, is the pronunciation of her name, reporter for The Guardian and Observer over in the UK, and a frequent window through her tweets into what's happening in the Brexit investigation there, tweeted the other day, Dear America, you need to get to grips with the story dominating the UK press. Probably makes some good sense to do that. Today, she says, and this was yesterday, we reveal how the Russian ambassador to the UK, groomed the funders of the Brexit campaign with offers of a sweetheart deal. That's the Brexit campaign led by Bannon, of course, Steve Bannon, friend and Trump ally Nigel Farage. And that's sort of a scary prospect, and it's interesting. And I don't know whether I'm curious what led the Russians to target both the UK and the United States. I mean, they're obviously chief rivals geopolitically, but is it because they have a lot of English speakers and they thought that they could troll social media in English very well? Did they do this in France? Did they not have French speakers? I'm not really sure what led them to take those two. Maybe it's just top two on the list. I don't know. But there is that connection, and they're investigating it and pushing us to recognize it. We probably ought to do that maybe another day. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I am furiously scrolling through Pocket to see if I can't find all the various things I wanted to bring you, and I have scrolled all the way back, and there it is. I knew there's so much happening, so many stories out there. I literally couldn't. I've buried a thing that I meant to share with you not that long ago, but May 31st seems like an eternity. Now what? I've constructed this sentence terribly. So what am I going to say? It seems like an eternity ago. That's not really all right. It seems like so long ago. And I didn't bring it up. And since then, it's been brought up again in another context and by another writer. And everybody, I guess, thought it was his idea. And so I need to do something to try and straighten that situation out. But okay. So Carol Cadwalader, I hope, has provided us with an article that everyone should read. And I'll give you the tweet, and it has the link to the Guardian article, just so you can stay up to date with what's happening on the UK side. Aaron Banks met with Russian officials multiple times during, or rather before Brexit vote is the headline on the piece. Documents seen by observers suggest multiple meetings between 2015 and 2017. Aaron Banks, by the way, in case we don't know, pardon me, the millionaire businessman. What? Really? Who bankrolled Nigel Farage's campaign to quit the EU, had multiple meetings with Russian embassy officials in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. Documents seen by the observers suggest, the observer, that is Banks, who gave £12 million of services to the campaign, becoming the biggest donor in UK history, has repeatedly denied any involvement with Russian officials or Russian money, or that Russian money played any part in the Brexit campaign. But the observer has seen documents in which a senior Tory MP says, if correct, raise urgent and troubling questions about his relationship with the Russian government. I'll give you the bullet points. How about that? The communications suggest multiple meetings between the leaders of Leave.eu and high-ranking Russian officials from November of 2015, about the time when Trump was in, he got in earlier than that, right? But he's well established in the race at that point. November 2015 to 2017. 2 meetings in the week Leave.eu launched its official campaign. An introduction to a Russian businessman by the Russian ambassador the day after Leave.eu launched its campaign, who reportedly offered Banks a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to buy Russian gold mines. That's pretty flagrant, right? A trip to Moscow in February of 2016 to meet key partners and financiers behind a gold project, including a Russian bank. Last bullet point here. Continued extensive contact in the run-up to the U.S. election when Banks, not lowercase Banks, but Mr. Banks, his business partner and Leave.eu spokesman Andy Wigmore and Nigel Farage campaigned in the U.S., remember that, to support Donald Trump's candidacy. So, what's happening here? Well, plenty of things, including, of course, some pretty clear allegations that Russian money was being used to finance, in part, the Leave.eu campaign. A very distinctive sort of tactic that's going on here that I think, who I think captured it pretty well. I grabbed this tweet with it. Brandon Friedman tweeted over the weekend that and in response to this article and Carol Cadwalader's tweet about it. So, I mean, it's not like it's disconnected here. We're in the midst, he says, of the greatest transformation in warfare possibly ever. And Russia is leading the way. They've learned it's more efficient to achieve political aims by simply buying off the leaders of adversarial countries than through armed conflict. And maybe now it's more true than it ever was or could have been. And this is the sort of thing we've discussed in the past in terms of, the impact of big money on American politics, that it was beyond the contemplation of the founders that any individuals, and probably at that point any companies, would amass so much wealth that they could literally buy off entire swaths of the population or the Congress or the political class, etc. We just didn't really think about, I don't think they contemplated multi-billionaires. I mean, I don't think they really thought very much about money in terms of billions at that time. But I think this is sort of a new phenomenon. It just really hasn't been the case for very long. I mean, for quite a while, we had just such high marginal tax rates that it was not impossible, but it was certainly very rare to reach those heights. And now, of course, we've reversed things, and it's American policy to let people get as rich as they possibly can. And when they amass several billions in funds, it becomes nearly costless for them to just start distributing it in ways that weren't possible before. Not only there's the growth in two different areas that end up being related in many ways, that has warped everything politically in this country. One, the money, and two, the ability to collect, store, and analyze data, in an automated fashion, right? We've talked about that when we speak of things in the Fourth Amendment context very often. For instance, things that wouldn't ordinarily be Fourth Amendment protected, like license plate numbers, because you're displaying those things publicly. It was just the case that there was no way for human observers to literally read and track the movement of every license plate in America. But now, with computers and data storage and data processing, plus, the camera technology, drones, and the low costs of distributing those cameras everywhere, makes it possible to, at least in theory, track the movement of every motor vehicle in America in ways that, are so thorough that they feel like they're Fourth Amendment violations, though they might not be. Similarly, in the other side, on the money side of things, people have come to be in control of such vast amounts of capital that they can literally, what if somebody could buy out the entire advertising capacity of an entire city market for an entire electoral cycle? Or let's say somebody put together the money and the data processing technology, for instance, to overwhelm the advertising capacity of a major online platform like Facebook, or could say, it doesn't matter how many iterations of this ad it takes to get to the point where we've perfected an ad that can instantly, whatever it is, whatever you're aiming to do, convince everybody that Hillary Clinton is hopelessly corrupt, or brainwash some vast swath of American voters. I mean, it's like you're talking about real science fiction outcomes. But, I guess if you're able to spend endless amounts of capital doing it and just flood the advertising capacity completely, we didn't really think about what would it, what protection should we write into campaign finance law to prevent and a Dr. Evil from a hollowed out volcano from buying every single advertisement in the New York metropolitan area for 5 years, such that there's no messaging, commercial messaging whatsoever, save their political ideology. What mechanism do we have to deal with that? What mechanism would we have to have anticipated that? None. What Brandon is saying here is conducting warfare may be falling prey to exactly the same thing. Conducting war is war fighting is an expensive undertaking, and never more so than it is now with our sophisticated weapons, some of which cost literally billions of dollars a piece. So it's a tough thing to do. And of course, remember originally our big plan under good old Ronald Reagan was to spend so much money on our own defense and thereby cause what the Soviets at the time probably hoped was an equal and opposite response. We were able to sustain, it is alleged, we were able to sustain that level of funding of the military, whereas the Soviets were not. And eventually it did prove true that they were not. And I mean, in reality, it proved true that we also were not, but we were able to deficit fund all of it, well, for many reasons, not least of which I guess Arliss Money could tell you about why we were able to create an endless money supply for ourselves. I guess the Soviets should have been able to operate similarly with their own fiat currency. I suppose they should have been able to do anything, but it didn't hold up very well, and I guess their industrial capacity wasn't there to back it up, etc. Anyway, we know how this ended, supposedly in the end of the Cold War, with, I would imagine, the Russians rather embarrassed about not having been able to compete in and win that arms race. Somewhere along the line, though, some of them realized, well, this is much better for us personally because we're, rather than indulging our communist ideology and getting nowhere, why not abandon all of that, embrace hyper-capitalism and become insanely wealthy and then separate ourselves from the problems of society entirely. Post-Soviet Russia got you down, powerless Russia, bankrupt and unable to stand up for itself and hold itself to its former glory as the Soviet Union, if that's what you ever believed was the case, or finding it frustrating the lack of law and order in the streets and the dissolution of Russian society got you down. Become a billionaire, become an oligarch, buy your own security force. Don't depend on society at large to organize itself along what used to be the most efficient lines for a peaceful life for millions. And instead, simply take care of yourself. Live in an armed compound, have 24/7 bodyguard protection, bulletproof cars, and all the money you could hope to get, and sock it away in other countries occasionally, both to avoid the tax man and to have places to make a soft landing, perhaps many of them, if you ever need to abscond from the former Soviet Union. This is what they were able to put together for themselves, and this is basically the life goal of Vladimir Putin and his friends, to become so rich that the dissolution of society around you doesn't matter, doesn't impact you. By the way, I foresee this as a future problem for us as well, and it may just be the case that we're slower at it, and maybe Trump is accelerating it now, but the idea, for instance, that life under Trump got you down, well, move to San Francisco, work for Google, make a boatload of money, can't get to work on time because traffic's a problem and San Francisco can't keep up with public transit. Don't worry, Uber will start a service that looks an awful lot like buses, but that isn't because it's Uber, and you can get your food, drone delivered to you, and no reason to have to venture out onto the dangerous streets where there's no longer any money to, patrol the streets or fund police, and besides which you might be black, and so you don't want to be out there with police, right? But, what if we get to this situation? Or what if ultimately the situation is somehow black entrepreneurs. I don't know why they would do it in particular, but this is actually a good idea. Maybe black entrepreneurs ought to be doing this and taking their cues, I think, from Vito Corleone, right? Wall yourself off. You don't have to be black separatists about it. You just say, look, it's dangerous to be out there on the street. A wealthy black entrepreneur could bring several folks with him on this if he distributed his profits evenly enough. Who knows whether that'll happen? Well, don't go out on the streets. Have all your food delivered by DoorDash drones and order everything from Amazon.com, and we'll turn our campus into an armed compound that the police have no jurisdiction in. A very wise experiment to conduct. I guess we would have paved the way for that. But then again, what will eventually happen is white people will say, damn it, why do they have this and we don't? Let's go, kill them, bomb them. It's the new move house. Who knows what they're plotting in there? And that'll probably work too. Sorry to say. So, all right, don't waste your time with it. I don't know. But anything is possible. I fear, for instance, that may become the preferred solution. I don't mean to hang this on millennials because it's time to bash millennials, but because you'll be the people who are still alive at this time, and the rest of us will have aged out of this game. And I wonder whether that wouldn't present itself to you as a viable option and say, look, as long as I've got money and technology, I can wall myself off from these problems, and maybe that's the only practical solution because the problems have just gotten too big in our country. And if you can't make it in, the elites circles, we feel bad for you. We'll campaign for nice liberal politicians who say they want to help you guys, but in the meantime, I ain't going there. That's what that's the big picture fear here. But I just began on Brandon Friedman's tweet that, we are, as he says, in the midst of the greatest transformation in warfare possibly ever. The one in which they decide, yes, it costs trillions to compete militarily, and we do need to keep an eye on that because that's the enforcement arm. Those are our leg breakers. We're going to do this mob style. How does Vito Corleone, how does the old style mob make its money and survive in the world where all of what they do is illegal? They got to buy judges. Can you buy every single judge? You can buy a lot of them, and Vito Corleone had the biggest collection of them around, but you had to make sure that, you got assigned to the right judge if you were in court or, whatever. You could lean on somebody. They couldn't buy everybody necessarily, but that's only because Vito Corleone wasn't a billionaire. What if he was a billionaire? What if you really could buy every judge? What if you could buy Congress? What if you could buy the whole Congress? What if you could buy at least enough of Congress that occasionally they would do something dumb like say on tape somewhere that I think we've all been bought by Russians, or at least some of the key players here have? Or what if you in fact had succeeded in buying so many of them that the Speaker of the House said, shh, don't tell anybody. It's true. But if you keep your mouth shut, we'll have supreme power in this country forever. Oh, well, now that you mention it, that is a good idea. If you were going to spend trillions on defense, and let's say you got to the point in our military evolution where ultimately that's all pointless. We have $1 trillion worth of weapons. They have $1 trillion worth of weapons. But all it ends up in, all there is net here is mutually assured destruction. Right? We all launch our trillions of dollars worth of weapons and we all die. Nobody gets to live to say, we won in all of this. Maybe you survive for a few weeks in a bunker and then come out and say, well, we won and now I'm dying, or there's nothing worth living for. Not very productive use of your money, but what if instead of spending trillions and trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons and missiles, you use trillions of dollars to find ways to leverage the politicians that we over here on this side, for whatever reason, have elected to put in charge of our military by electing them. I mean, it was an election, a choice of ours to build our system this way, that our elected officials would be in charge of our military. Okay, seemed like a reasonable thing to do at the time, will of the people and all that. But then they, as it turns out, they fell victim, and maybe it wouldn't matter who chose them in the first place if they fell victim to bribery anyway. But Is it a more efficient use of your money to try to build a weapon that will somehow sneak in first and blow up the other side's weapons, although it seems like science fantasy to conceive of such a thing? Or is it a better use of your money? How much would it cost to build this super weapon? $1 trillion? We don't actually have that. What can I do with $1 billion? Well, with $1 billion, even at high prices, I mean, think about it. $1 billion is 1,000 million. Yes? Well, for $1 million, could you just outright buy off politicians? What would a member of Congress do if you just dropped $1 million on them? Not as a campaign contribution, but just dropped $1 million. Like, this is yours. I'm giving this to you. Not a campaign contribution. I'm sure you would like that too. But could you just say, I'm giving you personally $1 million, but I need your attention on this stuff? And there's more where that came from, because that's just $1 billion. A person who's worth $3 billion could do this 3 times over, or hit 300 politicians with it if you could find 300 willing takers, right? The point is, what if you just spent your money saying, instead of buying weapons to compete against their weapons, what if I buy the people who are in charge of launching those weapons, or building those weapons, or buying those weapons? And convince them, don't worry about it, because we're going to be friends now, you and I. All you have to do is, I don't know, let's say, break up the Western Alliance so that the weapons I didn't buy are no longer quite as necessary as they were before. And I can divide and conquer, or at least make people so mistrustful of their allies on the NATO side that there's no questions asked when I invade and annex Crimea, or anywhere else for that matter, if I have eyes on other things. What Brandon, I think, is identifying here is, yeah, we've moved on to this new phase whereby the Russians, if they can engineer ways for the people in charge, for whatever reason we've put them in charge, or if for some reason the people in charge are not amenable to this, can we engineer it so that we get different people in charge, like Donald Trump, let's say, or people loyal to them, or we can keep them there. And look, all you do, you'll stay on the gravy train as long as you keep doing what we want to do. The minute you don't do it, we may drop the bomb on you at not the big bomb, but, drop a shoe really on you somewhere, and we'll find ways of replacing you with someone else who will be more compliant. But what if we get to pick policy or run policy for you guys? Then we have little reason to have to worry about bombing you. You're doing what we want. So break up the Western alliances. And that way, like I said, if we were to invade Poland, right, normally NATO would respond to that at this point. But later they don't, because NATO isn't NATO. No one country can swing it anymore. And if the United States and the UK both say no because they've been bought out by the Russians, then who stands for defending Poland? Who will roll into Poland to try and stop the advance of the Russians? The Germans? That has not worked out very well in the past. They may, in their own self-interest, have to feel like they have to do that. But we don't want to get to that situation again, where they feel like it's in their interest to split Poland in half with the Russians, right? More bad parallels. So it's definitely worth thinking about. Things that were not possible before. Ends that were only achievable collectively through warfare, which is not a really good way of doing anything, but that was the only way it was possible to do these things. Are now simply financial transactions. There really are enough people who have amassed enough billions of dollars that they can be prevailed upon in a coordinated way, or even if they act in their own best interests on their own, the market will bring them to this, right? They will start spending their money in ways that will undermine the sovereignty of countries with which they've had previously an adversarial relationship. And hey, in the end, who can argue that this is not a good thing? Maybe this is actually movement towards world peace, or that science fiction-y, science fantasy world government, Star Trek style. It's just, we always figured it would be under American-style auspices, if not American auspices. Where's the headquarters of Starfleet? San Francisco. Where did I say that you could, just sort of remove yourself from society if you needed to, and do everything privately? San Francisco, actually. This is the example I gave up. But anyway, like I said, in the science fiction writing of the future, everybody sort of figures it happens under American auspices. What if it simply happens under Russian auspices instead? I mean, they've got billions of dollars. They've got resources. Why is the headquarters of Starfleet not in Moscow? Maybe it would be. Maybe that's not their interest. Maybe that's not their end. It could certainly go a very different direction. You know, Mr. Spock with the beard sort of direction, Bizarro world direction. But I mean, who's to say that that's not the case? And Donald Trump is using that as cover. Oh, being friends with the Russians is a good thing. That's peace, right? And maybe it is, and maybe it's just this weird ethnocentrism that we've had in the United States. That, well, if there's going to be a world government, it should be under American ideals because we're for democracy and stuff like that. But money may be more important to most people than democracy. It's certainly beginning to look like that. And if the Russians have more of that or are using it more aggressively and in a coordinated fashion, we'll probably lose to that. That's actually a good way to lose a war to Russia. It's not going to happen militarily, if only because it all ends in mutually assured destruction. Anyway, there's more to it than just that, and stuff that we didn't get to but really need to. But we really need to spend more time on it. I want to, though, acknowledge, speaking of non-traditional methods of warfare, the article from May 31st in Maclean's magazine from up in Canada. Canada, very much in the news these days. Trade sanctions against America won't work, says Scott Gilmore. Trade sanctions against America won't work. Sanctioning Trump himself might. And many of you who were following over the weekend on Twitter saw that I was talking about it. Also, Matthew Iglesias has picked up on the idea, interestingly enough, in like the penultimate paragraph of his piece, saying exactly the same thing. He acknowledges, oh yeah, actually Scott Gilmore said, he doesn't name him, but there was another article out there that said something like this after my fantastic article. I say this came first to my attention from Scott Gilmore's article. I recommend it to you. And it goes something like this, without being able to share all of it with you. The idea I distilled from it anyway, and I assume is Gilmore's main argument. Canada now in the business of responding to America's trade sanctions against it, which are nonsensical. Their response is theoretically sensible under the old order, where politicians could be assumed to be representing the best interests of their state. This is no longer happening, of course. And they are, in very traditional fashion, targeting the United States with retaliatory sanctions in the hopes, I guess, that Donald Trump cares about the United States. Further, they're actually being quite aggressive and quite, thoughtful in a way. That is to say, they're doing some thinking about what are the sanctions going to be, and can we target them such that the greatest impact falls in, let's say, those red states we keep hearing so much about that are Donald Trump's base. Surely Donald Trump will care about pain being inflicted on his base, because his base will squeal and they'll tell Donald Trump that this is wrong and bad and they don't support it, and then he'll be forced to move off of that position. Except Donald Trump doesn't care about red states either. They elected him, and that's great, but they're full of people who aren't him. That's the big problem. And a mechanism exists for making Donald Trump feel how unwise his decisions are. It's just one that exists for a very different purpose, and it may be time to move to the realization that that purpose is revealing itself. The trade sanctions, Scott Gilmore argues, and I agree, ought to be, or at least I think this is something we ought to consider, ought to be focused on Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is the person that Donald Trump cares about. He doesn't care, as Daniel Dale pointed out, all the people who are suffering under the sanctions. He's not a farmer in Pennsylvania. He's not a manufacturer in Ohio. Donald Trump is none of those things. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. How do you target Donald Trump? Hit him in the business, so to speak. That's one way of putting it. He's got businesses. He claims to have businesses and business interests around the world. Hit him. Sanction them. The way the United States sanctions Russian oligarchs. He would love it, to be honest. To be labeled an oligarch would be like a huge honor for him. Remember, he was in Russia. He was so happy he met all the oligarchs were in the room. He thinks he's an oligarch. Hit him like an oligarch. How do you do it? Well, some people it would be difficult to do that with. presidents who divested themselves of all their foreign assets, or even domestic assets for that matter, would make it very difficult to target them personally versus actually having to resort to targeting at least parts of the United States. Not Donald Trump. He thought he was not going to divest, and he was going to be very smart, and he was going to use it to leverage other countries. He forgets that there are reciprocal problems with that, and ones that we wanted to avoid in the Emoluments Clause by saying we don't want other governments to be able to jab the president personally either, because then he'll do things that are not in the best interest of this country, but rather in the best interest of himself. So he's left himself open to this, and in spectacular fashion. How do you identify Donald Trump's assets abroad or anywhere around the world? Well, how about if he puts gigantic golden letters on them that says, this is something you can target to hurt me? Luckily, he's actually done that. And so maybe, just maybe, we ought to be targeting him, and our allies around the world ought to be doing the same. Or, well, we can't do it because he's in charge here. Target his stuff. Well, sanction him.
Daily Kos
like the
Radio
Russian oligarch.
On networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
There's been a lot of interest in the idea, and I don't know what the situation is in some of these countries and whether they can do so legally, but how do we do it? How do we sanction Russian oligarchs? However we do it ought to be paralleled in other countries. They ought to let them know that they mean business. That might be something they pay attention to. You should pay attention to justice coming up next.